Perfect, so we expect you all to participate in diplomatic bridge activities. Thank you and see you soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Thank you, of course, for receiving us in this new edition of Diplomatic Webinar. As you know, I am Dr. Mehdi Rais, CEO of Diplomatic Bridge, and today we are going to discuss about multilateral diplomacy in our Diplomatic Webinar, the third edition of this year. So it's the first one open to the public, and I am very honored to receive one of the most important women in the Arab world, coming from Palestine, Professor Dalal Ariqat. She's a leader, woman leader of World Economic Forum, of course, but she's also a professor in American University, professor of diplomacy. And today, she accepted to discuss with us about a very important topics, diplomatic topics that influence international relations today, especially in this context. As you know, multilateral diplomacy is a type of diplomacy that bring together countries to collaborate inside organization or inside institution about global issues. We all know that one of the most dangerous and also important issues is the war in Gaza. So we will have the opportunity to discuss with Ms. Dalal or Professor Dalal Ariqat about that. But first of all, I would like to give her the floor to talk a little bit about multilateral diplomacy, the presentation, the challenges, the issues, and also the perspective in a few minutes before we start talking together. Thank you so much, Professor Dalal Ariqat, for accepting our invitation, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehdi. It's my pleasure to be with the Diplomatic Bridge and to discuss an important topic which I am a fan of. But before we delve into multilateral diplomacy, I would like to give just a very brief introduction to diplomacy. Diplomacy as a term was coined by not long time ago. Because before the label of diplomacy was given, it was called negotiations. And I wanted to share this information because this is the baseline where diplomacy had grown and had developed as a field of study, and whereas today we find it as a scientific field of study. So when we define diplomacy in the 21st century now, it is the conduct of relation between sovereign states, but not only through the official mediums. And why do I say that? Because until the 20th century and with the emerge of the nation states, when diplomacy started, it was basically the conduct of international relations, of foreign policy between the official mediums of every state, meaning the foreign ministries of every state. Today, with the globalization, with the technological revolution, with the openness that we are witnessing in the world via, for example, the different telecommunication tools, the social media platforms, the connectivity of the human beings all around the world, now we have many other tools to diplomacy, where diplomacy had developed to a level where public diplomacy is important, media diplomacy is important, this is part of what you are doing now. So you are employing different tools of media, Twitter, X, social media, all those kinds of diplomacy had developed because of the changes that the world had witnessed, where now non-state actors are also important in the conduct of international relations. Now, if we want to move to diplomacy has different levels or tracks, and one of them is, of course, the multilateral diplomacy. But there is also the bilateral diplomacy. When we say bilateral diplomacy, it means the conduct of relation between two states from on binational level. When we say multilateral, we basically mean it is the involvement of different actors, of a group of actors. For example, we have what we call the international organizations, the United Nations that was created after World War II, and before it was the League of Nations. For example, we have the Arab League in the Arab world. We have the EU in Europe. We have the African councils or groups, or the Islamic organizations. So when we refer to a platform that brings together the representatives of different states, that's how we can refer to multilateral diplomacy. So it's basically where a multi-states come together on a certain platform to work towards the improvement and the conduct of international relations of different multi-state actors. So multilateral diplomacy was found to be very important because we found ourselves as human beings and as states facing global challenges. And when we say global challenges, we talk about peace and security to start with. But we also have contemporary challenges which have to deal with the contemporary security issues that have to do with nuclear weapons. And then what we are facing today with climate change and with water scarcity, with food scarcity, with pollution, with some pandemics or diseases that can spread widely. And smuggling, for example. So those are the global challenges that we are facing. So when we talk about UN, for example, the United Nations, which was created after the Second World War, it's important to look at the United Nations and see how it is somehow a part of the multilateral diplomacy. However, even in the UN itself, the UN is split into different divisions or bodies. For example, in the UN, we talk about the Security Council at one level, the very senior or executive level, but we also talk about the General Assembly, and then we have a Secretariat, and then there is the Economic and Social Council and the International Court of Justice. Every single body of those that come under the umbrella of the UN also have a certain mission and function in service of the diplomatic relations or the conduct of relations between different states. So it was found very important that multilateral diplomacy develops in our world, and that's why we also saw the evolution of different conventions and different international agreements to set the ground rules that would limit or guide the states' relationships. So, for example, we saw the Fourth Geneva Conventions in 1949. The Fourth Geneva Conventions came to organize or guide the relationships between states and civilians in times of war, for example, or the civilians who get imprisoned or the civilians who get kidnapped. So the Fourth Geneva Conventions came to regulate so many aspects in times of war in protection of the civilians. Later on, we have had, for example, the conventions of the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic Relations in 1961, and then the Vienna Conventions on consular relations in 1963. The Vienna Conventions came to regulate the diplomatic relations for every state, the state itself, and in its relation with the on the binational level and on the multilateral level. To structure the diplomatic corps, the diplomatic representations, the functions, the conduct of relations, to make sure that the ground rules are set for how this relationship will be conducted. And then later on, we have had other agreements. For example, we had the Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which was adopted by almost all the countries around the world. And then we saw the Convention on the Child's Rights. We have many agreements on women's rights leading to CEDAW. And recently we had witnessed the development of different treaties on, for example, the maritime laws, international law, humanitarian law, the Genocide Convention, many international and of course, agreements that dealt with issues relating to women, to youth, to good governance, to weaponry, to smuggling, to the conduct of international relations, to climate change, to global challenges, leading to also the SDGs, which is the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN adopted as a mechanism for all the countries to help, the cooperation between the the North and the South countries, meaning the developing and the developed countries. So if we talk about the idea and the rationale about multilateral diplomacy, it is not contested. It is not disputable that it is very important for the evolution of international relations in a way that would guarantee, for example, equal basis of rights for citizens in every state. And that would guarantee that every state, for example, reaches a certain level of standards in the 21st century that would apply to all citizens in all states, no matter where. And it was also seen as a tool to enforce the collaboration on states level. In facing the challenges or the obstacles or the barriers that a certain country might face, and whereas some other country might be of help in countering those challenges or problems. Years later, after the start of multilateral diplomacy and the practice of multilateral diplomacy, we had started witnessing how multilateral diplomacy acts. And we had seen a number of successes when it came to multilateral diplomacy, and especially at the Security Council or at the General Assembly or at the International Court of Justice, and then the International Criminal Court, where some issues that had the international labeling were not able to be solved on states level, so they were taken into a multilateral diplomatic level at those international legal tools. Yet, as you touched upon, Gaza and the genocide of the Palestinian civilians of Gaza under the Israeli military occupation, it was very much hoped by the Palestinian people that the tools of multilateral diplomacy of the UN, the Security Council, and the European Union and other groups all around the world, in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, in Asia, and the BRICS and the African Union, to come together and make diplomacy succeed in countering the war crimes which were documented. However, after the Gaza experience, we as professors of diplomacy were somehow not only disappointed, but ashamed to a certain level, because we continue to teach all the theories and the case studies of diplomacy, bilateral, multilateral, and then we advocate for the diplomatic tools. Whereas when it came to the most urgent humanitarian need to employ and utilize multilateral diplomacy, unfortunately, humanity was failed. Diplomacy failed the humanity, and international diplomatic tools failed humanity in Gaza. So now the question is, some people tell me, you still teach diplomacy, you still talk about the UN diplomacy, the Security Council, General Assembly, and the international legal tools, the ICC, ICJ, etc., whereas when on the ground, what we had witnessed in the Palestinian case was more and more complexity of this international multilateral diplomacy that unfortunately gave coverage to the Israeli war crimes, that unfortunately this multilateral diplomacy did not succeed. And then my answer would be, it is not really the multilateral diplomacy to blame, but it is the double standards and the double conduct when it comes to the different players in this international system. Because after the genocide in Gaza, we have witnessed how some players, some superpowers, have some hegemony over the tools of multilateral diplomacy. We have seen, for example, how the US alone stopped 2 UN Security Council resolutions, if not 3, on ceasefire for Gaza. We had seen how some superpowers had stopped the will of more than 140 states in some cases. So it's not really the multilateral diplomacy mechanism that I would like or I would think is to blame, but rather the conduct of certain powers and actors in the multilateral diplomacy. This is in no way to say that multilateral diplomacy is fine and that it doesn't need any reform. No, I think it's wise and it's very important nowadays to reassess and reevaluate how multilateral diplomacy works, and to admit that the multilateral diplomacy system in our international order needs some reforms and needs some good governance where, for example, the question of the 5 permanent states in the UN Security Council enjoying the right of veto is questioned now. It is very legitimate to question that right now, because we had seen how one country could block the will and the intention and the desire of the majority of the world if one country vetoes, for example, any resolution. So when we talk about diplomacy, I want to reiterate that diplomacy remains a very important tool in our world. It's a diplomatic tool, it's a legal tool, a civilized tool, a humanitarian tool, a peaceful tool, which is not contested, and it is not harmful. It is away from the use of violence and fire and bloodshed. And what we had witnessed in the 20th century in the world, the different war crimes against humanity, the World War I or II, we should learn the lessons of the outcomes and the consequences and the humanitarian losses that the world had witnessed after those wars, where the idea of multilateral diplomacy came. So now we cannot just come and abandon those tools. Those tools were brought and they were created to save humanity and to say never again to bloodshed, never again to war crimes, never again to wars, but to resort to legal tools and to diplomatic tools and to the peaceful tools in resolving conflicts. Because we cannot just say that conflicts will vanish and be eliminated tomorrow. Conflicts will continue to exist or be created because of the human nature, and because it's never granted that people nor organizations or companies or states would agree on everything. So we will have disagreements, we will have disputes, and we will have conflicts. But the difference is how do we evolve and how do we advance and develop, and how do we deal with those conflicts and disputes and disagreements. And here I must say that diplomacy is one important tool that should not be abandoned. Multilateral diplomacy is vital. However, when it comes to the enforcement of multilateral diplomacy, when it comes to how do we utilize the multilateral diplomacy, I think it needs some governance, some reform, not only in the Security Council and how the system works and how some countries enjoy some certain privileges better than other countries, but also the fact that when some certain countries violate international law, when some countries like the State of Israel, for example, violate the 4 Geneva Conventions, or violate the Genocide Convention, or the Convention on the Child, or any international humanitarian law treaties, the fact that so many countries have been tolerating the ongoing war crimes that Israel has been committing against the Palestinian people, that the world had been tolerating apartheid, which was a documented war crime that Israel has been implementing, this should not be tolerated in 2024. Because now the war crimes are documented. So when one country violates international law, it is not up to us to just discuss and win arguments. Things are documented today. And we need to speak the truth, and we need to speak the facts, and we need to hold the criminals accountable. This is the basic idea of the international system and the multilateral diplomacy. When we come together and we set the ground rules of how we want and how we envision the actors, then if one of those states come and violate this international system and this international order, we should be bold enough, we should be just enough and diplomatic and legal and peaceful enough to hold that specific country accountable, and to make sure that a certain specific country does not continue to enjoy impunity while other countries or other peoples of humanity suffer. I will stop here. Maybe if you have different questions or specific questions regarding multilateral diplomacy, to make sure that the discussion is vibrant.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for your important presentation. It was very, very, very good and very important and interesting. I share with you a lot of ideas, to be honest, because multilateral diplomacy is vital, as you said, and it's fundamental to face issues and global issues that we are living in this complicated world, if you want to say. But I will start my first question to you directly. I will start by your last idea, reforms. we agree that the international system and the multilateral diplomacy is vital and everything is it's important. But in terms of efficiency, we can see lack of results. So for you, what the reforms do you think are necessary for more efficiency and legitimacy of the international or multilateral diplomacy? So these terms of reforms, as a professor, as a perspective, what do you think should be done or should be do to improve a little bit the results of multilateral diplomacy?
Thank you very much for your question. And well, I am not the first one who is speaking about reforms in multilateral diplomacy. There are many academic papers and different calls from different scholars who have been calling for the need of reform in the international system and specifically in the UN system. So this is not a new invention. However, it needs a collective will. It needs a multilateral diplomatic will to admit and confess that this system is not working well in some cases. And that's why I focused on the Gaza genocide and the Israeli regime's war crimes against the Palestinian people, because this had been documented on every screen, and it had sparked an outrage all around the world, where we all have seen how one country had blocked the UN Security Council resolutions over and over again. So when we speak about reforms, I don't want to say that we will have a magic wand and that we will, with an abracadabra, act, we will turn things 180 degrees, and it will be like a magic act. However, first, I think that the states need to agree multilaterally that there is something wrong with the international system. Like, for example, when we see the Secretary General of the United Nations coming out crying or begging certain countries to respect the UN system, we should say that there is something wrong. We should realize that there is something wrong going with this international system that needs at least some immediate actions when it comes to the respect of respecting the different articles of this international system. And here I want to mention, for example, Article 25 of the UN Charter, where countries should invoke that article to make sure that every country respects its legal and ethical obligation under the Charter. Because this is one of the main problems in the UN system, for example. Whereas all the state parties, the signatory state parties, they sign to respect and accept every article under the Charter. But when it comes to practice, we don't see everybody, applying or implementing the different articles, even if we have Security Council resolutions. Like we saw again in the case of Gaza, for the Security Council resolution that was passed on ceasefire. It was temporary. It was just for the month of Ramadan. But we had seen an unprecedented event where we had seen a binding Security Council resolution not being implemented, when state parties did not respect the article, their ethical and legal obligations in applying that article on the ground. When we talk about diplomacy, we're not saying by any means that states should resort to Article 7 and to use force in order to enforce certain resolutions. No. But when you look at the case of Palestine and you see that we have the Palestinians' rights have more than 100 Security Council resolutions, that the Palestinian cause had more than 800 General Assembly resolutions that safeguard every right for the Palestinians, the right to self-determination, the right to liberation, to freedom, to self-determination again, the right of return to the refugees. So the settlements being considered as illegal, the wall, the apartheid wall as illegal. We have so many different UN resolutions that safeguard our rights in the UN system. Whereas when it comes to practice, unfortunately, when it comes to enforcement, what we see is more settlements, more military occupation, more apartheid, more extrajudicial killings, more confiscations of lands, more violations of the international system, more violations of those UN resolutions. And I'm focusing on the case study of Palestine to give it more, weight. But it is not the only case in the international system and the UN system that is being violated. We had seen so many other countries that violate, of course, but nobody compares to Israel. Nobody compares to Israel. And here I want to also mention the recognition of states. When states are recognized, usually in the mechanism of the United Nations, states resort to the Security Council to absorb that recognition. And when Israel announced itself as recognized itself as a state back in 1948, it was granted that recognition without fulfilling one of the important conditions of every state, which is the borders, the definition of borders. 76 years after the recognition of Israel in the United Nations, Israel still violates that condition. So I would expect from the international system and the state actors to at least address Israel and ask it to respect that condition of recognition by defining its borders. I would expect those states to, when they pass a UN Security Council resolution on ceasefire, to impose ceasefire. I would expect them in their conduct of diplomatic, peaceful, and secure relationships to stop, for example, the arms sale to Israel, or the military aid, or the financial aid and the strategic aid that they give to a system that is committing war crimes and genocide, when this state is actually being sued at the ICJ, which is the body, a multilateral legal body of the international system. And when this ICJ is ruling for the plausibility of Israel in genocide, I would expect that all state actors, abide by the basic regulations of this international system and its articles. But to continue to tolerate that one state acts above all laws, and one state acts as it's an exception state, then okay, let's consider it a pariah state that is not party to this international system. So we either, the reform process means that we, for example, insert or adopt certain tools that would guarantee equal measures to every state when it comes to their respect of and legal and ethical obligations toward the UN Charter, or simply just consider that state as an exception and treat it as a pariah state and not part of an inclusive international system. I think this would need a lot of debates, but for first and foremost, I think it needs a multilateral admission and confession that what we had witnessed in the past years, whether in Ukraine-Russia relationship, Palestine, Israel, that this system, the multilateral diplomacy, needs reconsideration, because it's a pity that we had created all those international humanitarian law agreements and international conventions and international bodies, and that a lot of energy and time and money is being spent for not guaranteeing at least equal measures of relationships between state actors and this international body.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Dalal. It's very interesting. But you are talking. I'm reading some comments, and there is a question that I think is important for me and for the audience. Someone has asked you technical question actually. In what ways can NGOs and non-actors, international non-state actors and NGOs can contribute to multilateral diplomacy? I'm sure that someone is leading NGOs who ask this question. So we would like to know how NGOs and non-actor states can improve or contribute to improve the multilateral diplomacy.
Well, thank you. In our current reality, and with this, again, the globalized world and the technological revolution, we have what we refer to as public diplomacy in the field of diplomacy. And in public diplomacy, non-state actors matter a lot. Actually, non-state actors are the mediums and are the main actors of diplomatic conduct when it comes to humans on individual level, when it comes to NGOs, as you know, non-governmental organizations, when it comes to artists, when it comes to academics, when it comes to architects, when it comes to media people and journalists. So those are basically the non-state actors who we refer to. And the NGOs make a good portion of the non-state actors. because of its intensity all around the world, and the fact that public diplomacy is actually legitimate. We see, for example, that twinning agreements between different cities, right? You hear about twinning, twin cities, the twinning relationship. You hear about the twinning agreements between the chambers of commerce in different cities. This is, again, another level of the conduct of international relations, and that would, at the end goal, benefit the conduct of international relations between the two states. But the immediate actors are not really the ministries of foreign affairs of every state. The immediate actors are actually the business people of the different cities on their individual capacity. It's the different NGOs that come together in, for example, countering a certain challenge. It's the different artists or individuals who have the same expertise. And you have also part of the public diplomacy is also what we see in times of catastrophes and natural disasters, where you see some experts, some doctors, some engineers come to the rescue of other countries. This is not the conduct of formal diplomacy on official level of the ministries of foreign affairs, but the non-state actors, where the NGOs play a great role. And the NGOs should know that they have a great role to play. They should not abandon that give up that role, because the fact that we have an international system of the NGOs, international non-governmental organizations, those are supposed to cooperate and collaborate and come together with the NGOs all around the world, everyone in their own specific expertise, to deal with certain issues, like, for example, the issues of water, or the issues of climate change, or food, or things that relate to the human needs of every country nowadays. This should be the work and the driven factor of the NGOs that should come together, and with the help of the grassroots, with the help of the people who get involved in this, what we call third track diplomacy, for example. But NGOs and third track diplomacy is a very, very important player in the conduct of diplomacy, not only on the NGO level, but also that would feed back into the country level and international level diplomacy.
Perfect, Professor. It's very important. I agree 100% with you, because public diplomacy, it's the third track, as you said, or maybe fast track to encourage state actors to improve their results, and also to create this peacemaking. So that's important. And today we are living the context of ECOSOC Youth Forum. So we can see how NGOs and non-state actors can participate to create this dynamic in the diplomacy. Another question, important, very important, because lots of people prefer to see in the diplomacy this kind of bilateral diplomacy, because bilateral diplomacy has more effect, maybe more impact today in this actual context than multilateral diplomacy. So for you, Professor, what do you think about this question? To go and to enforce the bilateral diplomacy because there is more result, or focus on the multilateral diplomacy with all the challenges and issues we know, but it's still a system that we can create peace in the world?
This is an interesting question, and I will not give a yes or no answer. Because as a person on the individual level, I believe that we live in a very interdisciplinary world order, where it is important to come together on a multilateral level. I do value the collectiveness. I do value the structures of more inclusivity for different actors to deal with any challenges around the world. However, if I look at certain cases in diplomacy, I confess that multilateral diplomacy had somehow hindered some solutions, and had somehow stood as an obstacle in reaching certain solutions, because we have a big excuse of that we need a consensus from all parties. So it is much easier to get to faster diplomacy and conduct of peaceful relations on the bilateral level. And especially if we focus on the important and powerful countries in this case. However, if we want to ensure equal measures of treatment and that every people in every nation state enjoy the same measures and standards of the international world order, that's how we need multilateral diplomacy. Yet, I will give you an example of the recognition of the Palestinian state. We have been calling for the recognition of a Palestinian state, which had been blocked in the Security Council in 2011. And then we got the observer non-member state in 2012. Now, and I think it was supposed to be discussed this week, today and yesterday, the renewal of the Palestinian request at the UN Security Council to take Palestine and recognize it as a full state. The excuse that I hear from so many foreign ministers, let alone the US, but also in the European Union, in the EU, is that, we need a consensus from all the countries involved in order to recognize the Palestinian state. To the point where it is not a secret, this has become like a pretext, an excuse that certain countries are using, and they're not willing to recognize the Palestinian state. And here I have to admit that, yes, bilateral diplomacy can be much more effective and can be much faster and can achieve better end goals in less time and less violence and less energy and money. However, this doesn't mean that we don't need multilateral diplomacy. The question is really interesting, but I would argue that it really depends on the case. It depends on the challenge. It depends on what we are the issues that we are dealing with. And as much as I am a fan of multilateral diplomacy, I admit that in some cases, bilateral diplomacy, which is the conventional diplomacy, by the way, and the old diplomacy kind of style of diplomacy, can be much more effective in certain cases.
Thank you, Professor Dalal, for this answer. It's a very complicated question, actually. I assume that it's very important, and your answer gives me more vision to ask you maybe a more complicated question. It's about regional organization. I mean, the regional organization are completing the multilateral diplomacy, or maybe it's are more like I would like to I don't want to say يعني خصم, but I mean it's completing, to be honest, completing the multilateral diplomacy, or just suppleting the multilateral diplomacy. That, I mean, my philosophical question a little bit. So it's kind of completing this multilateral diplomacy, or is challenging the multilateral diplomacy?
No, I think I can list the regional diplomacy under the umbrella of multilateral diplomacy. Because also in regional diplomacy, you would find, for example, in the Arab world, the Arab League, or some other different regional the diplomatic groups that focus on youth, or some regional organizations that work on women issues, or educational issues, or policy issues. Again, I would like to argue that those multi-actor platforms are important for us to come together, for us to have brainstorming sessions, for the ideas to move around, for the thinking to be more collective, for the decisions to be more inclusive, for the solutions to be more sustainable and strategic. Yet, in some cases, yes, we had seen how some regional diplomacy had came at the expense of the official diplomacy that could be conducted in certain states. And this comes sometimes because of the inclusion of what we label as para-diplomacy. And para-diplomacy here, we refer to the non-state actors, the non-official state actors, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, is not included in that process, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the official tool of diplomacy of every country, is not consulted. Here, things can become dangerous If the efforts are shattered, and if every organization, every NGO or every city or every chamber of commerce or every individual or artist or academic is working on their own and with their own vision and their own goals and dreams, without putting the priorities of the state, the nation state's interest as a priority, without any consultations and coordination on state level, yes, this might be very dangerous, and this might hinder the national strategic interests of every state. That's why I would argue it's important that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually keeps good relations, or maybe creates a public diplomacy department where they keep the channel of consultations, discussions, and group work and brainstorming sessions with all the other different actors, not in any way to undermine them, but to make sure that everybody is coordinating, everybody is on the same line when it comes to serving the national interests of every country, rather than competing with its interests on state level.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. There is a question. I'm trying to go with my questions and also the audience question. There is a question, technical question actually. They said, as a professor of diplomacy, what do you think about soft power and influence in the effectiveness of multilateral diplomacy? How soft power influence the results of multilateral diplomacy? Before to go to another question is more juridical question.
The basic definition of soft power is basically public diplomacy. When we say soft power, we refer to non-violence, we refer to non-state actors, we refer to the individuals, we refer to the players, the athletes, the musicians, the actors, the academics, the architects, the journalists, everybody who can play a role in portraying one's country and make it more attractive in the eyes and the hearts of other people's nations. So it's basically, we say it's soft power because you use certain tools, you use your public, your individuals, your heroes, your cuisine, your tourism, your uniqueness of every country to attract the hearts and the minds of the different audiences all around the world. That's when you target the audience, that's when you target the public of another nation, in hopes that when you convince the public, their opinion will be reflected in the foreign policy of their own state. Hence, it will, of course, have a positive impact on the bilateral relations between the two states. So soft power is very, very important. It's public diplomacy, and it was coined by Joseph Nye in Harvard. However, when we say soft power, I want to say that soft power doesn't mean soft language. It doesn't mean in any way soft language. When we say soft power, it means the utilization of every tool possible in diplomacy, every legal tool, every diplomatic tool, every wisdom, every logic, everything that makes sense to get your gains and interests and the interests of your nation, but never means that you have to speak any soft language. On the contrary, you can speak the toughest language as much as you are not using violence in reality.
Yeah, Moroccan couscous is a way of soft power.
Yes,
by the way.
it is. It is big time, big time.
Yeah, exactly. So not maybe one last or one before the last question. I know your time is very short, and again, thank you for being with us. Lots of people, lots of professors, of diplomats say that multilateral diplomacy conducts just to sign treaties, agreements, and memorandum d'entente. But in the reality, in the ground, these kind of treaties and agreements are not really respected by the countries which have signed these kind of treaties inside, for example, United Nations or African Union or other international organizations, and that's treaties are not really taken as concrete solution to finalize global problems like climate change, for example. I have this example of COP, United Nations Conference of Climate Change, etc. A lot of discussions, a lot of negotiations, maybe a lot of treaties and agreements, etc. But on the ground, we saw exactly that there is no results, no kind of any will to do something. So this kind of approach for you, Professor, it's correct or?
I can't say no, because this is the application of from theory to practice. Because in theory, when we teach diplomacy, it's very nice, it's very fine, it's very correct,
Yeah.
it's very carré, as we say. But when it comes to practice, when it comes to real life, yes, there is some misconduct when it comes to the implementation on the ground. However, from a legal perspective, it is known and then it is not disputable that when countries sign into international conventions and international treaties, every country, when they sign, they have an obligation to harmonize, and I repeat, they have an obligation to harmonize their local laws in accordance with those international conventions and international treaties. However, yes, when we look at on the ground in practice, not every state goes immediately to that harmonization. Not every state implements immediately. And yes, there is a lot of time and energy being wasted with the different meetings and with the different conferences. But unfortunately, that's how diplomacy works. It's not a magic wand kind of effect that I would dream of. Of course, I would desire. And some people say that diplomacy does not work and that they give up on diplomacy, whether it is multilateral, bilateral, regional uh, conventions, just because of that reason, Dr. Mahdi, that you just mentioned, that we see how much time and energy and investments it takes sometimes in discussing a certain issue or a certain challenge. And for us, like a couple of individuals might come up with the answers or the solutions. It doesn't really take a genius sometimes. However, the way that multilateral diplomacy is conducted makes us somehow feel very disappointed and somehow very frustrated of how diplomacy is run on the multilateral level. So I don't blame those people. However, people like us and in diplomatic also circles and in NGO circles, we need to push and we need to criticize. But our criticism must be, constructive criticism. It's not for us, to get rid or eliminate the diplomatic tools, but we need to constructively criticize the mechanism and the way it is being conducted to make sure that it develops and it evolves in the service of humanity and peace and security for everybody on equal basis in the 21st century.
Exactly, Professor. And I am reading some comments, and there is a lot of comments talking about future, perspectives. So I think my last question for you, Professor, is what do you think about the perspective of multilateral diplomacy based on your prospective approach as professor and also as a diplomat?
Listen, if we are future oriented and if we learn from history and if we learn from the current existing experiences on the grounds all around the world, not only in Palestine, but we will learn that violence can only breed more violence, and you cannot continue to reward those who commit violence, because if we are future oriented, we must care about the humanity, and we must care about the peaceful tools and the diplomatic tools. However, we need to make sure that human beings are treated as equal, no matter what our color or our religion or our language or our ideology or our religion is, no matter what, because we did not choose it in the first place. So the basic principle must be that we look at each other as equal human beings, and that those articles, conventions, or international agreements must be applied and imposed equally on every state, no matter how powerful they are. So if we look from that perspective, which is future oriented, yet it is anchored on our human values, Human values are very important, and they will last forever because we are humans at the end of the day. So as much as smart as we could be, and as advanced as we could be, and as technological as we could be, and we can be the best startup nations of the world, and we could go to the moon, and we could bring about technological and soft solutions, or the carbon emission solutions and encountering the environmental challenges. However, as long as we're not able to solve the humanitarian conflicts in peaceful tools, I don't think humanity will prevail in this way. But if we are more humanitarian inspired or driven, and legally and diplomatically and peacefully driven, then we cannot abandon the diplomatic tools. Whether it is multilateral diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy, we need to ensure that every state is being treated equally, and that every human being and every citizen of every state enjoys all the different human rights that apply to all children, all women, all youth, all men, all citizens of every different countries in this international system on equal basis.
Thank you so much, Professor. As I promised you, we will stop at minute 50. Now we are 51, 30 seconds. I know you have a commitment in a few minutes. Again, thank you so much. It was a very, very important discussion. You are the guest of the first diplomatic webinar open to the public, because actually we organize a lot of diplomatic webinar inside institutions. Now I think we are motivated to do more and with you again. So thank you so much, Professor. We received you online, but we look forward to see you with us here in Morocco, among us in other activities. I know you visited Morocco once, but I think you should visit us more and more, and we will invite you to other activities. So again, thank you so much, Professor. Hope that everything will be finished well in Palestine and Gaza, because I know it's a tragedy, it is a catastrophe, and a diplomatic tragedy, to be honest. And I'm sure that the situation will change soon. So thank you so much again, and hopefully to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I wish you best of luck.
Thank you so much, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, our diplomatic webinar for today is finished. Rendezvous in next month with another diplomat, another professor for another topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.